Montana Territory, 1887. Nora Callum had 3 hours left to save the only home her father had ever given her, and the only thing she could sell for the missing $10 was the horse her father had told her never to give to the wrong man. At noon, Harlan Voss had stood on her porch and delivered his final warning: $14 before sunset, or the county would begin the process of taking her 40 acres. Nora had listened without arguing because she knew the numbers were real. She had $4.40 in her pocket. That was everything she had earned from selling preserves, sewing shirts, and finishing embroidery for the women in Cedar Falls. $4.40 against $14 was not a problem that hard work could solve before evening. Voss had already turned away when Nora closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the bread cooling on the kitchen table. Her father had always told her that panic made people make expensive decisions. So she forced herself to breathe, walked outside, and looked toward the small paddock behind the barn. Hope lifted his white head the instant he saw her. The horse had belonged to her since she was 17. Her father, James Callum, had brought him home as a young gelding and placed the reins in Nora's hands. "This one is yours," he had said. "He'll carry you farther than you think." 14 months had passed since James died, and Hope had done exactly that. He had carried Nora to market, carried her sewing supplies, carried sacks of grain home, and carried her through the lonely months when there had been nobody else to depend on. But now Nora walked toward him, knowing what she had to do. She rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes. Her father had left her one final instruction about the horse. If the day ever came when she had no choice but to sell him, take him to Robert Shaw. Robert knew horses. Robert was honest. Robert would never mistreat an animal for profit. Nora had remembered those words for more than a year. She had hoped she would never need them. That afternoon, she saddled Hope and rode toward the Shaw Ranch. Robert Shaw owned 500 acres across the valley, along with cattle, barns, hired hands, and enough land to make Nora's 40 acres look painfully small. He had known her father for years, but he had never treated Nora like a helpless girl after James died. He had watched her work from a respectful distance, believing that a proud woman deserved the chance to prove she could stand on her own. Now, as Nora approached his gate, Robert was working with a young sorrel horse. He noticed her immediately. He handed the reins to one of his ranch hands and walked toward her. "Nora," he said, removing his hat. She swallowed hard. "Robert, I need to sell Hope." His expression changed, but he did not interrupt. Nora explained about Voss, the $14, the $4.40 she had managed to save, and the deadline before sundown. "My father told me that if I ever had to let Hope go, I should bring him here," she said. "He said you'd take care of him." Robert looked at the white horse for several seconds. Then he looked back at Nora. "How much?" $10, she answered. "That's all I need to close the gap." Robert understood immediately. She was not asking what the horse was worth. She was asking for enough money to keep her land. He could have handed her the money and taken the horse, but something about the request bothered him. "Come inside," he said. "We need to discuss more than a horse." Nora followed him into the ranch house. She expected questions about Hope. Instead, Robert asked about her farm, her debt, her sewing work, and how she had managed, alone, for 14 months. When she told him she had been earning small amounts wherever she could, Robert glanced toward the pantry. Nora noticed the disorganized shelves before he did. Flour beside lamp oil, sugar hidden behind sacks, supplies purchased twice because nobody knew what was already there. She said nothing. Robert poured coffee. "I need someone to manage this house," he finally said. "My housekeeper left months ago. I have 5 men working outside and no proper system inside. You understand accounts. Your father taught you bookkeeping." Nora stared at him. "Are you offering me a job?" $3 a week," he said. You keep your farm. I'll advance you $10 against your wages today. Pay Voss and keep Hope. He can stay here where there's better pasture. Nora immediately shook her head. I don't need charity. Robert's voice remained calm. Neither am I offering it. He looked directly at her. I'm offering work to someone who knows how to work. Nora studied him carefully. And Hope? He stays here too? Robert paused. Your father trusted me with him. I'd rather give you both a home than buy him for $10. For the first time that day, Nora's certainty broke. She looked down at her hands and thought about the farm, her father's grave, the bread cooling in her kitchen, and the white horse waiting outside. Then she looked back at Robert. All right, she whispered. I'll take the position. Robert stood, walked to the desk, and counted $10 into her hand. Nora closed her fingers around the money. Before sunset, she would return to Voss with enough to stop the sale. But she did not yet know that the decision she had made that afternoon would change far more than the fate of her farm. Nora paid Harlan Voss before the sun disappeared behind the Montana hills, and the look on his face told her he had expected to see her surrender instead. She gave him the money without explaining where it came from, took his receipt, and walked away, with the first real sense of relief she had felt in months. The next morning she returned to the Shaw Ranch, not as a guest and not as a charity case, but as an employee with a clear agreement. Robert had promised $3 a week, an advance against her wages, and a place for Hope in the ranch paddock. Nora intended to make every dollar count. On her first morning, she discovered that Robert's cattle operation was efficient, while everything inside his house was chaos. The pantry had no order. The accounts were scattered. Across several ledgers, supplies were being purchased before old supplies had been used. Nora spent the entire day making lists, counting inventory, and creating a system. By the third day, the ranch hands had already noticed the difference. Tom, Robert's oldest hired man, walked into the kitchen and stared at the shelves. Where's the sugar? He asked. Where it belongs, Nora answered. Tom frowned. It was beside the kerosene. Exactly, she said. That's why it moved. Tom stared at her for a moment and then slowly nodded. Robert knows you're changing things? Robert hired me to manage them. Tom smiled faintly. Then I suppose he does now. Robert did notice. He noticed the cleaner accounts, the better meal planning, the reduced waste, and the fact that his men stopped complaining about missing supplies. But the biggest surprise came when Nora discovered several old invoices that had been paid twice. She spent hours comparing receipts and ledgers and finally found more than $1,000 in unnecessary payments. Robert stood beside the table while she explained what she had found. You're telling me I paid these suppliers twice? He asked. Not exactly. You paid some twice and overpaid others because the accounts weren't reconciled. Robert stared at the numbers. How long did this take you? 3 days. He leaned back and gave a quiet laugh that contained no humor. My father would have fired me for this. Nora smiled slightly. My father would have made me correct it before supper. Robert looked at her differently after that. He had known James Callum was a capable farmer, but he had never understood just how much of that capability had been passed to his daughter. Nora's father had once told Robert that his daughter could keep a farm alive with a pencil, a ledger, and enough stubbornness to outlast a drought. Robert had remembered those words but never understood them completely until now. Weeks passed. Nora worked hard and kept their arrangement strictly professional. Robert respected that. He never tried to use the debt as leverage. He never treated the room she occupied at the ranch as a favor. Hope had settled comfortably into the paddock and quickly became part of the daily rhythm of the ranch. Nora visited him every morning before breakfast. Robert began noticing how often she smiled when she thought nobody was watching. He also began noticing how much the house felt different with her in it. In December, winter arrived hard. Snow blocked the road between Nora's farm and the Shaw ranch, turning her short horseback ride into a dangerous journey. Robert finally told her that riding back and forth made no sense. "The east bedroom is empty," he said. "Stay here until the weather breaks." Nora hesitated. "I can manage." "I know you can," he answered. "That's not the point." She moved into the east bedroom that evening. She told herself it was temporary. But slowly, the ranch began to feel less like a workplace and more like a place where she belonged. She learned Robert's routines without trying. She knew he drank coffee black, that he checked the weather before breakfast, and that when he was worried he read the same page of a book twice. Robert learned that Nora hummed quietly while working and that she became completely silent whenever she was thinking through a difficult problem. One cold evening, Nora found Robert in the barn repairing an old leather tool. She recognized the mark immediately. It had belonged to her father. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Robert looked down at it. "Your father lent it to me years ago." He turned the tool in his hands. "I should have returned it after he died." Nora touched the worn leather. "He would rather see it being used." Robert nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "Your father talked about you often." Nora looked at him. "What did he say?" Robert smiled. "That you were stubborn." She laughed softly. "That sounds like him." "He also said you were the reason the Callum farm would survive him." The smile disappeared from her face. He believed that? He knew it. Outside, snow struck the barn doors, while hope shifted quietly in the stall. Nora realized that Robert had not simply bought her time when he gave her $10. He had given her an opportunity to stand again without taking away her pride. And somewhere between the ledgers, the winter mornings, and the quiet conversations after supper, something neither of them had planned was beginning to grow. January arrived with hard winds and frozen roads, but Nora had finally begun to believe that the worst part of her life was behind her. She still owned the Callum property. Hope was safe. Her wages were steady. The house accounts were improving every week. She had stopped counting every coin before buying flour. Yet one debt remained, and Nora refused to forget it. Every month she had been setting aside $2 to pay Harlan Voss until the original loan was completely cleared. On a bitter Monday morning, she rode into Cedar Falls with the exact amount in an envelope. She walked into the lending office, placed the money on the counter, and waited for the clerk to record the payment. Instead, the clerk opened the ledger and frowned. He checked another page, then looked back at Nora. "Miss Callum, this account is already closed." Nora stared at him. "No, it isn't. I still owe money." "You did," he replied. He turned the ledger around. The remaining balance was paid in full. Nora's eyes moved to the entry. $8, paid several days earlier. The name beside the payment was Robert Shaw. She stood completely still. She remembered Robert's words when he had first offered her the position. $3 a week. $10 advanced. Keep your farm. Keep hope. Nothing about paying the rest of her debt. She folded the envelope and placed it back inside her coat. On the ride home, she tried to convince herself that Robert had simply considered the payment part of the original arrangement. But she knew him well enough by then to know that was not true. He had done it quietly because he knew she would have refused if he had asked. When she reached the ranch, Robert was outside near the cattle pens. He saw her ride in and immediately recognized the expression on her face. "You found out," he said. Nora dismounted. "You paid Voss." Robert did not deny it. "The account was hanging over you. That wasn't your responsibility. Neither was giving Hope a place to stay." She stepped closer. You told me this was work, Robert. You told me it wasn't charity. It isn't. He looked at her steadily. I didn't pay you. I paid a debt that was keeping you from sleeping. Nora's eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. You had no right. You're right. He paused. But I did it anyway. She looked away toward the barn where Hope was watching them through the open stall door. Why? Robert took a breath. Because every morning you wake up and work as if the entire world depends on you. Because you refuse help until you're already exhausted. Because your father trusted me. And because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as my housekeeper. Nora looked back at him. What do you think of me now? Robert's expression softened. As the woman who makes this place feel like home. Neither moved. The winter wind crossed the yard, carrying snow across their boots. Nora thought about the afternoon she had arrived asking for $10. She had believed she was selling the last piece of her father's life. Instead, Robert had protected it. He had given Hope shelter without taking ownership away from her. He had given Nora work without asking her to surrender her independence. And now he had quietly erased the debt that had haunted her since her father's death. I came here because I needed $10, Nora said. I know. I thought I was coming to sell Hope. I know. She smiled through the tears she finally allowed to fall. Instead, you gave us both somewhere to belong. Robert stepped closer. That's what I was hoping you'd understand. Hope gave a soft sound from the barn, breaking the silence between them. Nora laughed, wiped her cheek, and looked toward the horse that had carried her through the hardest 14 months of her life. Her father's final advice had been simple. If she ever had to let Hope go, take him to Robert Shaw. James had been right. Robert had treated Hope better than anyone could have expected, but perhaps her father had known something else too. Perhaps he had understood that some people enter your life not to take something from you, but to help you protect what matters most. By spring, the Callum farm was producing again. Nora used her wages to repair the roof, buy seed, and restore the kitchen garden. Robert never asked her to give up her property. Instead, he helped her improve it. Their arrangement slowly changed, not because either demanded it, but because trust had grown into something stronger. Tom was the first to notice. One evening, he watched Robert carry a basket of fresh eggs toward the Callum house and shook his head. That man has finally figured it out, he muttered. Months earlier, Nora had arrived at the Shaw Ranch desperate, carrying $4.40 and believing she had only one choice left. She had gone there prepared to sell Hope for $10. She returned with a job, a safe place for her horse, freedom from the debt, and eventually something worth far more than money. She had gone looking for someone who would treat her horse fairly. Instead, she found a man who treated her with the same respect. And in the wide Montana territory of 1887, where survival often depended on what you owned and how much money you had, Nora discovered that sometimes the greatest fortune was not land, livestock, or gold. Sometimes it was simply finding someone who looked at everything you were trying so hard to protect and quietly said, "You don't have to lose it anymore." This is Broken Saddle Stories, where every frontier tale carries a secret worth remembering.